Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Newkirk. Sorry, let's start over. Liz Newkirk, Manager of Digital Media at Loebsack and Brownlee. And I am here with Equality NC today, and we are here to talk about LGBTQ plus and fair housing. This is a major issue and just kind of a follow-up that we did in a discussion that we did with Loebsack, Mr. Chris Loebsack, Managing Principal of Loebsack and Brownlee. And we wanted to partner with this amazing organization and bring a little bit more limelight to this issue, particularly in the multifamily industry. So if everyone can just kind of go around and introduce themselves. Ms. Kendra, I will start with you.
Hi, my name is Kendra Johnson. I use she and her pronouns, and I serve as the Executive Director of Equality North Carolina. We're the oldest statewide organization working for the civil rights of LGBTQ people in the country. Specifically, we're based in the Triangle area, but we work statewide. And I am absolutely delighted to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to some great questions and some great engagement so you get all that you need to better serve your clients. Thank you.
Thank you.
And hello, y'all. My name is Ames Simmons. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm Policy Director at Equality North Carolina. I've been here about 3.5 years. I'm an attorney by training and moved here from practicing in-house in healthcare in Atlanta, and am really honored to be able to do this work at Equality NC.
Hi, everybody. My name is Crystal Richardson. I use she, her, and her pronouns. I'm an attorney at Loebsack and Brownlee, and I am also an active an advocate for the LGBTQ community for equality for everyone.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here, and I appreciate you all introducing yourselves, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, we do everything from training and education to raising up the realities of LGBTQ plus people and the realities that they face in their day-to-day lives. And we also do policy implementation, advocacy. We endorse candidates because we know that without representation in political spaces, a lot of our work is null and void. What we see largely in the LGBTQ community is there is a lot of stigma still about people and their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And those factors really impact every aspect of people's lives, from the moment they are born to the moment that they enter school systems, you know, depending on gender stereotypes, depending on a family's religious background. We see a lot of people facing significant family rejection, and much like many of the marginalized communities like African American, Latinx, women, we see those things play out with a bit of a cradle to prison pipeline. In terms of youth homelessness, family rejection really plays a significant factor. We see a lot of young folks who are bullied in their home and at schools, and some of the bullying is sanctioned by the personal beliefs of some school administrators, which leads to an untenable situation where we see youth effectively being policed in schools, pushed out of schools, feel unwelcome, and many times without a supportive environment at school and at home. We see our youth in particular being pushed out onto the street. I was really, just to bring this home, I was speaking with my daughter just this morning, who was a student at Bennett College. She's had a good friend who she started with. She's now at Spelman, but her friend identifies as a lesbian. Her family was moving, and essentially because of her sexual orientation and other issues, her family chose not to house her in the same facility. So we're in the pandemic, this is a young college student whose family opted not to allow her to move with them, and who has been sleeping in her car for several days, and now is checking herself into a mental hospital because she has had suicidal ideation. She cannot stay with her boyfriend, who is a trans man, because his family is also unsupportive of her sexual orientation and his gender identity. And she found herself without any recourse in the middle of a pandemic, trying to survive alone just because of who she is and who she loves. And that's just one small situation that we regularly see. I know that Ames can talk a little bit more about statistics and what we see with trans and gender nonconforming folks. Ames, if you want to chime in about the realities that we see nationwide.
Thank you, Kendra. I'm really sorry to hear about your daughter's friend. It's
Yes.
upsetting. Kendra started talking about this sort of cradle to prison pipeline. And I think the importance of school discipline on LGBTQ people is a significant factor in their contact with the juvenile legal system. So some of the statistics that we know about are that young people who are unstably housed are more than 5 times as likely to have contact with the juvenile legal system. And there's a correlation of young people who have been involved in the juvenile legal system in some form or another with homelessness. So whether that is a chicken and egg phenomenon, I don't think the research has played out, but we do know that there needs to be more exit planning for young folks who are leaving the juvenile legal system and coming back into the community so that they have resources and aren't looking at homelessness. But I think we've also really come to understand through some important work by Chapin Hall in Chicago that family rejection is not like a one-time phenomenon that affects LGBTQ young people. That because we talk about like intervening earlier, before this, one incident that we think of as a youth being pushed out of their home, which is severe and definitely a problem. And there are lots of opportunities to be intervening in family systems way before that happens and working on issues like poverty, addiction, mental health support that families need. There's been some burgeoning analysis by I think by many of the LGBTQ organizations nationally, but really building off of some work that's been around for a while by Dr. Caitlin Ryan at the Family Acceptance Project, who really is invested in what can be done to try to keep families together, which is a significant component of preventing homelessness among LGBTQ young people. And certainly the realities for young folks who are trying to get by without homes is a dire one. And we see that there are young folks who become involved in sex work, for example, earlier than is health.
LGBTQ youth represent 40% of homeless youth, and in some studies 50% of homeless youth in this country.
I wanted to say thank you, Kendra and Ames, for being on this call, because as I hear you speak, I'm just reminded about the importance of your work across the state and across the country, because I think this is what it takes. The type of advocacy and the education that you provide, just saying those things here on the call, and the ears that it'll touch and impact. I hope that that type of awareness will start to shift some of these things. I personally think, Liz, your question was about why is the LGBT youth facing twice as much homelessness as cisgender individuals? And I think it really starts with the embedded institutional homophobia, and the impact becomes cultural and societal, and it looks like some of the things that Kendra and Ames just named. So I think it does start with talking about those conversations and really being aware that these are an issue. And then as Ames started to talk a little bit about the policies that are, and the impact in prisons and schools and things like that, I'm even reminded about my time as a garden ad litem with being in that individual youth are entered into the system by no fault of their own. So these are kids who primarily are in the foster care system because something has happened with their caretakers. And the education for LGBTQ youth, or the lack thereof, or the lack of acceptance, can also lead to children wanting to run away and be put in positions to do things like sex work to care for themselves, or other situations that can be really harmful to LGBTQ youth. And I think it's a serious problem that should definitely be talked about more. So thank you for uplifting the question and bringing that awareness.
So I would say, if just within the descriptor of where you're in the service sector as multifamily service providers, whether it's your law firm or some of the your clients that are working with families, it's important, for example, like in your role in marketing, for LGBTQ families to see themselves represented in your materials. And that goes a long way to, number one, helping LGBTQ people get an idea of where is a more affirming environment, but it also exposes cisgender and heterosexual people who are coming into contact with your firm or with your associations or with leasing offices with a greater representation of what society is really like, and ultimately that it helps to at least attune people to some of the institutional factors that Crystal was bringing up, because LGBTQ people aren't enough all by ourselves to help make the kind of societal change that we need to make a dent in things like
Yeah, I want to just echo what Ames said about visibility. If you think about, as a person who's African American, who grew up before there was great representation on TV, just being seen, and also indicating like that these units are for our families, it indicates that it's a safe space. Maybe there's cultural competency, and this is a place where people can apply without fear of rejection for whatever housing units that they're seeing. We saw, for me growing up, I'm a 70s kid. I want to tell my whole age. Now I'm 49, but for African-American folks, we saw more educated folks represented and different types of advertising. And that was, a welcome. These services are for you. This is a space where you can talk about the issues and individual needs that your family may have. Like, just seeing yourself represented in the advertising is a signal that this is a welcoming space, and that you're willing to negotiate and talk about the things that are necessary for people to feel safer in those spaces.
Yeah, I would echo that same thing. I think too many people are just either unwilling or unable to accept a lot of the members of the LGBTQ community. And so being able to not only have representation in your marketing materials, but on your staff, just having individuals there that people can come in and visibly see that it's a welcoming and diverse and inclusive place to, would make a person like me want to live there if I knew that these were the types of policies and practices that were at the property, and that you were actively engaging and being consistent with those policies. I think that is the key thing that any industry could do.
As a part of that too, one thing that we often recommend is that you have an affirmative statement on any of your websites about units that are going to be rented, that this is a place that does not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity, that's stated very clearly, and that, discrimination based on any category will not be tolerated at the facilities, based on race, on gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, economic status, all of those different things. And when people like myself are looking to rent, we look to see what those policies state, so that we know that it's a space. This is important for you. And again, you noted, different things about holidays. When you're thinking about celebratory things, there's, it goes a long way to have a little sign that says Happy Pride or a rainbow flag during Pride Month or LGBTQ History Month, because that shows that this is a welcoming and affirming property.
Number one thing is just reviewing your company's policies and how you address discrimination, and not just, put them in place, but talk about what are some of the repercussions, what will be tolerated, what won't be tolerated. Really make sure that your staff understands that, what discrimination is. What does it actually look like? Because I think that's also part of the problem. A lot of the housing laws, the fair housing laws, are really about a person's conduct or, the treatment of an individual. Are you singling out individuals, or is this something across the board? And so to do that, I think you have to make sure that you're turning inside and really thinking about the individual biases that a person has. And I think as a company, you have to create those spaces. You have to make sure that you're not just putting it out there, but you're also doing something about it and enforcing those things and being consistent with that. And then the feedback, making sure that it's welcomed feedback, that you're open to it, that the members on your staff can come back to you, and if something is problematic in regards to someone's race or gender or color or something that's discriminatory, that they can talk to you about it without any type of retaliatory action from their employer or that looming fear about microaggressions and things like that, but that this is genuinely a place that practices what they preach. And I think, just personally, I think we do a good job at that at our company, and just having those open channels to be able to talk to the person who's highest above, because sometimes you need to be able to have those channels to be able to go, higher than above your direct contact.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak directly to, the issue of why there are no explicit protections for the LGBTQ community. The modern civil rights movement for LGBTQ folks is still fairly new. We celebrated last year 50 years of Stonewall, the Stonewall riots and protests in New York, where people rose up against police brutality, and we're having this similar thing still happening, with the African American community and other and other brown communities, right? And poor, the same for poor whites and their police interaction. So we've been in the midst, in a lot of ways, of a culture war. And there have been affirmative measures that were taken, like the one in Charlotte, to implement some of those protections, which was a citywide ordinance. But what we saw was this huge backlash, which for folks who are situated in North Carolina or not, you are, I'm sure, familiar with HB2 and eventually HB 142 and how the state lost millions, if not billions of dollars because of the explicit discrimination that was written into state law, while actually one city was trying to provide affirmative protections. And so we have a culture war that is raging, and rather than tackle the issues that we've seen emerge in the pandemic that are related to a breakdown in healthcare or social safety nets like better jobs and combating violence in communities, groups have been singled out as targets and almost as a distraction. So we've seen that with immigrants, we've seen it with the LGBTQ community, we've seen it with reproductive rights, when we talk about abortion access in the country. And we have been, every time we make an advance, we've been facing backlash, either on the state level or on the federal level. So we still are lacking comprehensive non-discrimination protections in the workplace, public accommodations, housing, in our schools. And on the federal level, we need the Equality Act, which would guarantee all of those different things. And here in North Carolina, we need the Equality for All Act, which would create some statewide non-discrimination protections as well as protections in every other sector. So in the midst of this culture war, we're still in the middle of it, where our community has been largely demonized and seen as unworthy of access to some of these protections that are so vital. We recently had a major victory at the Supreme Court, at least in the workplace, where we saw that they prohibited discrimination. No one can legally be fired because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But that was, our first major advance in terms of federal protections, even just in the workplace, which should have been our starting point rather than marriage equality. Not that marriage equality is not important, but people need to be able to pursue a livelihood. They need to be able to have a safe home. They need to be able to access credit. And those things are still remain to be passed, and we have a long way to get them. Hopefully we'll be able to make some positive change because of, if nothing else, because of the pandemic, because I think it's elevating real crises that we're seeing for people who are marginalized in this country.
I will just add, it is not uncommon across the South to see a lack of statewide protections, as you noted, Liz, in whether we're talking about Georgia or South Carolina or North Carolina. I think what Kendra was bringing up is sort of the way North Carolina has been uniquely bad about preempting laws that would help provide protection in the LGBTQ community. And that's what, really what HB2 was about, was putting trans people in restrooms in front of a much bigger, more insidious public policy that was trying to prevent economic justice and worker rights, and especially for Black and brown people in North Carolina. And that kind of employment preemption, the way that the state has taken away local power to try to keep its municipalities' residents from discrimination, is a big part of people's lived experience here. I know there's preemption of fair housing in North Carolina, and it's part of this incredibly oppressive interlocking scheme where the state has reserved to itself the power to provide anti-discrimination, but also not enacting it at the same time. And I think the federal level is is equally as problematic, from what, as Kendra was pointing out, the importance of having sexual orientation and gender identity protections formally written into federal law. One of the impacts of the Supreme Court decision is likely that the prohibition on sex discrimination in the Fair Housing Act will be interpreted to include discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But the current Secretary of HUD, Ben Carson, has been steadily trying to dismantle any protections that Arne Duncan might have put in place under the Obama administration. So ostensibly, HUD is still saying that the equal access rule exists and that discrimination in housing based on sexual orientation and gender identity are not allowed. But we also see his department trying to chip away disparate impact in fair housing. We've seen them announce that they are going to just end the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And perhaps most insidious for our community, last month, HUD proposed to this rule that would allow emergency shelters to make their own determinations about someone's gender, which is going to have an impact of shelters being enabled to discriminate against transgender women. And this rule can, say all day that gender identity discrimination, it remains prohibited. It's true that, there's nothing on the face of the rule that says that it is an anti-trans woman policy, but that is exactly what it is. That's the folks that are going to be affected most directly by this trans shelter rule, it's currently in its public comment period, and we're doing everything that we can. We can talk some more about it later, to try to make sure that HUD receives comments from the public that this is not the kind of response to people in domestic violence emergencies, in homelessness emergencies. This is not the kind of policy that our country should stand for. So I think underlying the kind of violence that you're talking about, and again, I'm sorry for the experience that your friend had. I grew up in Atlanta also. I didn't think I would ever leave there. And I know I will never experience firsthand the kind of reality that particularly trans women of color are facing, because my whiteness and my maleness are going to overpower most of the marginalization that I might ever face. But I think that makes it especially incumbent upon me as an openly transgender white guy to be advocating for anti-racist policies that are also anti-violence. There's a term that's actually been coined here called trans misogynoir, which building off of misogynoir, which is a unique kind of hatred of Black women in particular. And if you put trans on the front of it, the concept here is that there's a unique kind of fear and hatred that our society seems to feel toward transgender women of color who bear the brunt of violence globally, but especially in our country and even in our state, where I guess we began really trying to track the murders of transgender people in 2015. The trans people who murdered in North Carolina since 2015 have all been transgender women of color. 1 in 2015, 2 in 2017, 3 in 2019, and 1 so far, Monica Diamond from Charlotte. And this is probably not the full report, because oftentimes the police and the media misgender or, apply the wrong pronouns to someone and use their birth name even when they're well known in the community by a different name. I think that anti-trans violence in some ways looks the same as intimate partner violence in the cisgender heterosexual community. So a lot of the things that you might be on the lookout for, or bystander intervention that your leasing agents might have gone through, though some of those same principles can be applied when we're thinking about trans violence. If anything, one of the bigger components of the public education that we've done around intimate partner violence in the trans community is the way that people think it doesn't exist. When people think that, for example, if law enforcement shows up and one of the folks who the police were called on is a transgender man, for example, they often just consider that person to be a woman. And law enforcement has sort of a unique way of not seeing violence among lesbian couples or among gay couples, either saying that normalizing it as a cat fight, or boys will be boys. There are some unique factors for sure within the LGBTQ community generally. There are additional risk factors like the threat to out someone or disclose their queer or trans status to others. That can be a power and control technique. And honestly, the criminalization of identities that particularly affects transgender women, whether we're talking about the fact that it's a misdemeanor to have HIV and fail to disclose it to your partner unless you've been virally suppressed for 6 months. The fact that it's a misdemeanor if you are sharing needles, even though some trans people have to do that for silicone, for example, if they don't have insurance that covers their some of their gender transition related health care. Those criminalized identities are also power and control tactics that can be used against transgender people. But again, I think that the key thing is for people to be sensitized of what they need to be looking for. And what we are increasingly coming to understand is the important role that housing plays as a social determinant of health, or what I have been calling oppression determinants of health, because really what we're talking about is the impact of discrimination on violence on oppressed people that is affecting our health. And violence is certainly one of the social determinants of health that I think affect transgender people uniquely. Some of the data that we have seen just in this advocacy around the trans shelter rule. For example, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has some North Carolina specific analysis that shows that 42% of trans people are unsheltered compared to 30% of cisgender or non-trans people. There was a survey fielded by the National Center for Transgender Equality in 2015. So it's this is getting to be dated. But then in North Carolina, the respondents to that survey, 22% had experienced some form of housing discrimination in the year prior to the survey, whether they were evicted because of being trans or denied a home or apartment because of being trans. So as we started off talking about, houselessness is something that is a condition that creates risk and vulnerability across many different contexts, whether we're talking about young people who are less able to attend school, or whether we're talking about people trying to recover from COVID. How difficult it must be to try to, be safe at home when you don't have a home.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and add that from the standpoint of like leasing agents, there needs to be cultural competency about differences of gender and gender identity, because ID documents are a huge thing. Ames does a lot of work around that. It is a costly process, and some people are unable to get identity documents that match. That match their presentation. So there needs to be awareness in terms of leasing that this is not, someone who is trying to commit fraud or trying to pull one over on the leasing agents. And so that's a huge barrier to begin with. So there needs to be cultural competency amongst the people who are dealing with the public generally to understand the realities of trans and gender nonconforming people, and all the complexities that come, because many times some of the violence actually emerges from the leasing agents. We saw a situation, and this is, we're in Days Inn in Charlotte. We saw a situation in the midst of the pandemic where people who had paid up for a longer term stay and an extended stay hotel were summarily evicted in the middle of a pandemic. Many of them were Black trans women or brown trans women, and some of them younger folks who had been homeless and who did not have ID documents that matched their gender presentation, which created a significant barrier for them to access additional housing. And, we provided support with them because of some of the bans on evictions. They were able to stay at the hotel for a little bit longer, but the facility shut off water. They shut off electricity in an attempt to push those folks out. And some of the people experienced violence, because other people began to invade the facility. We've had some of these women go to other properties and be assaulted by members of the security detail on the property, or be assaulted by, or be summarily evicted from another property because they didn't believe that these people matched the image that this property wanted to project, i.e., if you are not a person who is quote unquote passing as a transgender person, meaning that no one would know theoretically that you're trans, you're not good enough to be in this facility. And so you see people facing violence at the actual facilities at the hands of security, and other people on the property feeling empowered also to attack these individuals, or these folks not being able to rent at another facility because their ID documents don't match. And then it just becomes a vicious cycle where, unless these people have an individual who can go and rent a room for them or rent a property for them, as almost much like, I hate to keep going back to African Americans, but if we look at like the founding of Harlem in New York, it was white passing African American folks who were first able to get that property and then continued to do so that other people could build that neighborhood. And it's similar for trans and gender nonconforming people today.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the only thing I would add is in addition to that competency is just really understanding the lack of legislation that is out there that protects all members of the LGBTQ community, particularly trans individuals, particularly Black and brown trans individuals. I think about the domestic violence laws, for example. When you really get into those statutes, they do not protect same gender loving couples. So as I think Ames uplifted, when they say call the police, the folks that are supposed to protect you, a lot of times that can kind of turn it, into something else that could potentially be harmful to individuals of that community. And again, if you're a property manager and your goal is to keep the individuals at your property safe and to give them a welcoming place where they can call home, these are things that you need to be aware of. That, if anything, just know that it's happening when these individuals come to you with reports. Trust them, believe them. Again, just understanding that it's not something that individuals are making up or trying to pull one over you, but these are individuals' lived experiences. And if you can best understand that and make sure that you are putting best practices where, again, you are not being elitist and valuing one community member over another, then I think across the board you will be okay. And particularly thinking about the, just as Ames mentioned, violence can occur in any type of relationship, in any community. So it's not something that's unique to the transgender community. And I think it's just something to be aware that if you see an individual get harassed or harmed in any way, treat them as if you would any other member of society, and help to, if you can, in a safe way, get them the immediate help that they need. I think it's something as simple as that. It shouldn't have to be a glaring, like flashing light for you to understand that someone is suffering and that they potentially need some help. And so, again, embedding that cultural competency that Kendra mentioned, having that type of awareness that families are diverse, and what that actually looks like could be, for myself, for example, my partner identifies as a non-binary trans man who is Black. I identify as a Black woman who is queer. And so, being able to be out in the community in an environment where we feel safe is very important to us, as I think it is for everyone. And so keeping that type of mentality in mind, I think will take companies very far.
Chime in as needed. As I alluded, to when we started out, there are no comprehensive protections on a federal level for the LGBTQ plus community, and much like other groups that suffer stigma, family rejection, societal rejection, there is a need to ensure that there is fairness in access to credit, access to housing, access to education, access to health care, and the list can go on, and no discrimination in the workplace, etc. So the Equality Act is, the act that would create those protections, as well as for the LGBTQ community based on sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as some other classes of folks who are not protected on the federal level. And I'll let Ames talk a little bit more broadly as a policy director about all the things that it would do. But essentially there are no protections. And that's something that, the vast majority of people don't understand. And we see that the polls show that people believe that no one should be fired because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. There's overwhelming support for that, but most people don't know that those protections simply do not exist. So Ames, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit more about some of the nuances of the proposal, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Kendra. Yeah, the Equality Act has been in Congress since 2015, when it was first introduced by Representative David Cicilline, who is an openly gay member of the House of Representatives. It is building on a much longer history within the LGBTQ movement of trying to achieve employment non-discrimination through the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which actually started in the 70s with Bella Abzug, and passed a chamber, but was never able to get all the way through Congress. The Equality Act has also been passed in one chamber and is not likely to be passed by the Senate in its current incarnation. But it is a much broader law, as Kendra said. In addition to employment, it affects education, which we've already talked about as a site of discrimination and oppression across all marginalized communities. And the LGBTQ community is part of that. It also, for example, would, in addition to housing and public accommodations, it would outlaw discrimination in jury service, for example, which is something that has been a subject that's been at the U.S. Supreme Court as well as at the North Carolina Supreme Court here recently. And it would outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity and for any federal funding, which is massive considering, how big the U.S. government is in the republic democracy that we have. And it would, as Kendra mentioned, it would outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity and credit. We don't have any of those protections here in North Carolina either. The federal law would also plug other holes in the Civil Rights Code. So the Equality Act at the federal level, for example, would say that it would prohibit discrimination based on sex in public accommodations, which is not currently part of the Civil Rights Act. One of the more vexing aspects of legal gender transition for some people is when you change your name and gender marker, sometimes your credit score drops. That happened to me. I think it took me several months advocating with Equifax. My credit score dropped 150 points the quarter after my name change went into effect. And after that, the other two credit bureaus also lowered my score, although not by as much as Equifax. So I directed my advocacy there. And it honestly took me sending them a letter signed Esquire before I could actually get them to update their records. So, this is, somebody that I had brought every privilege that I could to bear on this situation, and it almost whooped me, as we say. And I fared so much better than a lot of folks. I had a friend in Atlanta. After she transitioned, she applied for a job that performed a credit check, and they denied her. They decided not to give her the job because there was a problem with her credit check. And so I think one thing that, the rental market could consider doing is finding other ways of evaluating whether somebody would be a good tenant besides checking their credit, because for some trans people, it's just, through no fault of our own that our credit has gotten messed up. So I think that's, that's one aspect of this that that the multifamily industry could work on.
Just to add, a lot of times discrimination has layers to it. It doesn't always just happen because you're Black or a woman. Sometimes it happens because you're Black, woman, and you're a part of the LGBTQ community. And so, and there's levels to it. Someone who identifies with all of those identities may be treated differently than like a white gay male, for example. So I think it's just important to enact a federal law that will protect everyone experiencing particularly these types of layered, intense types of discrimination that could be detrimental to your mental health, to your wellness. And, these types of things shouldn't whoop you, when you're just trying to live and survive just like, all other individuals. So I think the more we can encourage that type of wellness, the better off we'll be for it.
You're welcome, but consider us a resource
Mhm.
for continuing education around these and other issues related to the LGBTQ plus community. And thank you so much for the opportunity to, share some enlightenment on how you can better serve our community.
All right, everyone. Well, that concludes our webinar meeting, roundtable discussion for today. Again, thank you so much.